Hello and welcome to the Herland Report. My name is Iben Thranholm and I'll be your host on this episode of Herland Report. And I'm very proud to present today's guest, which happened to be the lady who normally sits in my place, the founder of Herland Report, the one and only Hanne Herland. Hanne Herland, very welcome to your own show. Both of us, besides being current affairs, political and religion reporters, we're also very committed Christians. You have a background as a historian of religions, you're also a best-selling author, and you're a Protestant. And I am a theologian and a convert to Catholicism. So both of us are very concerned about the de-Christianization of the secular society, or the Western society. And we would like to see a re-Christianization, where we take back our values and our faith and the meaning of life. So that's why we agreed that we should have devote some episodes on Herland Report to discuss Christianity from a political and social perspective, but also, and indeed, a spiritual perspective. We're going to talk about faith, and we're going to talk about Christian values, and we're going to talk about society. So here in the first episode, we would like to discuss the European values as Christian values, and how, unfortunately, we see that they're being brought down. But what are the European or the Christian values in Europe? What do they consist of?
This is a very interesting question because we've been through a very strong de-Christianization process in Europe that stems from probably some of the Marxist movement we saw in Europe. And understandably enough, the Marxists felt the need to revolt against the bourgeoisie and the strict elites of then Europe. There were many things that did not work properly. There were issues within the church that was really worth revolting against. There were power structures in society that the Marxists also revolted against. And they wanted basically really the rights for, the population and for the people, as we know as a Marxist slogan, the rights of the people. But I think as the pendulum has swung from one side, it tends often to swing all the way over to the other side of the spectrum. And I think that also happened in this perspective in such a way that the European value system was completely thrown out of the water. And we're living now in a post-European or a post-Christian kind of Europe, where the scorn against the traditional values that once made Europe such a great civilization is in full bloom in such a way that we speak about an extremism, an extreme secularism infused in the European elites in such a way that we tend to demonize everything that has its root in the old way of living.
But the question is whether Marxism was actually an anti-Christian ideology from the beginning. If you look at the Russian Revolution, it's very remarkable. What they want to get rid of is actually the Tsar, which is representing God on earth. And it was very important for them to get rid of him because they wanted to do away with the Christian culture in Russia. And then now we see, I would even say, the second coming of Marxism here. This time it's not about the ruling classes, it's about identity politics. But we can discuss that later. So I think from the beginning, Marxism was aiming at destroying Christianity. And that's what we're seeing here, first in Russia. Now Russia's taking back Christianity. Now we have the second coming of Marxism here, which is destroying all traditional institutions, family values, everything that Christianity actually brought to our continent. So how did Christianity influence Europe before? You think it's mainly the family, or you think it is the political life? And in what way did Christianity influence our society from for hundreds of years, thousands of years.
Pertaining to that, to go back to the 1700s, because we speak about the Age of Enlightenment, very many of the philosophers that worked at that time, John Locke and so many of these, were devout Christians. So many of the scientists that looked into and wanted to further and to have more knowledge about society, they said that God is rational, and rationality is at the basis of religious belief. And due to this, we need to examine the world even more in a rational way in order to find out more on how God created the world and the revolvement around science and all of that. So from the early 1700s, we also got the notion maybe there's a possibility that God doesn't exist. There is a possibility God doesn't exist. So that was also brought into the rationale of thinking. But ever since that time, we've got the notion that all vital way of thinking that we consider to be the modern way of thinking is something that stems from the Enlightenment period as they left Christianity at that time. But that's not correct at all, because when we look at European history and you see how ever since the Middle Ages and before the Middle Ages, how the Spanish scholastics, how the monks and the Catholic monks, how the university systems started coming out of Europe at that time. And we see how human rights, for example, the rights of each person stems from this period. This is the Middle Ages. And when they in the 1700s continued developing the concept of human rights, that was just a development that, came from the Christian thinking in the Middle Ages. So for one, if we can mention, the classical, historical foundational values that do stem from Christianity, that all the historians agree on stem from Christianity in Europe, would be the thoughts that of human rights. Each person has a specific value. This was a fundamental Christian value. When you go back and look at what Jesus spoke in the Bible, for example, you see he broke clearly away from the previous thinking and the way in that culture and in the cultures, the view of the human, the view of the woman, the thought of women's rights. He had a revolutionary way of engaging with women that was criticized by his disciples and others at the time too. The breaking away from the slavery is something that we saw also in the American West, mainly Christians that started speaking up against that. Those are, for example, some of the values that stem from a Christian root in Western society.
That's so true, and I agree totally with you, but nevertheless, some anti-Christian element was introduced. And today we see that most people would say, but those values you are mentioning, like equality and human rights, you don't need to be a Christian to have those values. Even an atheist can have that. That would be a lot of people's way to look at the world today, that well, it's fine, they came from Christianity, now we are grown-ups, now we can do on our own, we don't need this spiritual underpinning. So is that really true? Because I see that now our society in many ways are crumbling. Yes, we still have human rights, we have equality and all those good values stemming from Christianity, but we also see that society somehow is disintegrating. At least when it comes to mass immigration, we have difficulties to understand what is our values, whereas Muslims are very self-assertive. They know exactly what they believe in. We are struggling even to know what it means to be Norwegian or Danish, where I come from. I'm from Denmark. So we cannot even define what does it mean to be Danish. So there is something inside our societies that are disintegrating. Now I've put a lot of questions up in the air, but let's go back first to the anti-Christian sentiment. Where do you think it comes from? Because it seems like there was some kind of temptation to say, well, we can do without God. We don't need God.
Of course, one doesn't need to have some sort of a personal, spiritual relationship with God or anything like that, to understand the historical development of Europe. It's wonderful when you have atheists that are just great atheists. They just maybe grew up in atheist families, just never have had any understanding of spirituality or anything. So long as a person is honest, and so long as he dares to stand up for what is right and will search for the truth, that's a wonderful thing. His history, though, when you look at European history, it doesn't matter whether you believe that Christianity had a great influence on a number of the central rights and values in Europe, that stems from Christianity is a historical fact. Now, whether you believe in God or not, that's another issue.
But the big question is whether society can remain or can still be built on those values if people don't believe in the spiritual underpinning, or a spiritual foundation. This is, I think, a very important question today is, can society continue with those values and to be founded on them if nobody believes in where they come from?
That's an excellent thought, because we have to have ideals. And the question is, which set of ideals will produce the kind of society where people work hard to try to come closer to the ideals at least? And that would be the question, I would argue, pertaining to the European segment as well, that we have completely left the previous ideals we had, which could be summed up, one may say, in a generalizing way, in the 10 Commandments. Don't steal, don't lie, be honest, be faithful to your husband, be patient. Then we're over on the virtues. Be patient, be calm, be righteous. There's a number of these very hardcore ideals that are summed up, you may say, in the 10 Commandments, that I also think at one point in European history, we decided to, leave this set of ideals.
But do you really think it's enough just to live those values? Or do you think a spirituality is needed, where sort of you are relating to a transcendent power, which is actually the source of all those values? Or can you just, as a human being, be completely cut off from the source and just, live those values yourself, and then everything will be all right? I question that a lot, because I see right now where our Scandinavian societies are cut off from any kind of spiritual source. It seems that things are not going so well. So even though people are trying to live up to those ideals about equality and human rights, you're right, in people's private lives it might be a different story about being unfaithful to your spouse and lying and things like that. But at least on our common level as a society, we're trying to stick to those values. But yet, as I said before, now we have a lot of foreigners coming into our countries, and it seems for us even to be hard to define our own identity. So my main question is, and I would like to hear you reflect on that, do we need a spirituality to maintain those values? Or can we just be cut off from it and just try to live, in a more moral way and be a better person?
It's interesting to look at the way we view the human today in this kind of extreme secularism that we live in. We view the human as good. If anything goes wrong, it has to be the state's fault or society's fault. And this is a core Marxist value, actually.
Or your parents, that they did something.
Yes, could be. So there's a sense of a belief in the human as the greatest that ever was. The idea that the humankind is to develop something so beautiful that it exceeds God. We are the world. We are the children. There's a sense of, within the godlessness that we have today, you have this kind of feeling. And with this feeling, if you compare that view on the human to the way Christianity portrays the human, you're straight into the spiritualism. Because Christianity speaks about, and the religions in the world speak about the human as being split between good and evil. And you must fight that within yourself, which is evil. And that brings you straight into the question of spirituality. Because if the human is a fallen entity, he then would need a spiritual force, wouldn't he? And the help from somebody outside of himself in order to be able to choose to do that which is good. This is why when you look at the classical conservative views, Edmund Burke in England, who was so much against the French Revolution and everything, he said that we need to stick to the order. We need to stick to somehow motivating individuals to do that which is right, because he didn't believe when it comes to Christianity, it gives complete other solutions to the problems in the world. And if we compare the way society is developing today, and we look at the suicide rates, we look at the divorce rates, we look at the psychiatric issues that are so unbelievably many in Western society, the whole drug industry is fueling basically Western society, and you compare it with the lack of spiritualism that we have here. Maybe you're right.
I think one of the main problems is, and you actually just mentioned it, was that we have abolished the idea of evil. I mean, evil can be explained on a psychosociological level, and it means that there will always be an explanation that has to do with society or with parents or something that went wrong. You didn't have enough education, you were poor, you had a father who was not good to you. So evil as a kind of spiritual dimension, which has a sort of mystical dimension, that evil exists outside us, that there is the devil and the demons, like Christianity explains. We have completely denied this reality. And it means that evil really gets a free hand because we don't have the right means to fight it, whereas Christianity gives us clear directions on how to fight evil. So I think that what we have been missing out in the modern Christianity is the nature of evil. We don't want to talk about that because it's not nice to talk about something that is evil. So we would like to discuss or to present Christianity as something that is sweet and nice. But to me, Christianity is actually about fighting your own evil nature, temptations, and overcome the evils of the world with love. And I know we're going to talk about that later. But I think Marxism is actually guilty of taking away our understanding of evil, which is, an even bigger evil, you can say, because that means that people don't have the right understanding and don't have the right means to fight evil in their lives. And you see this kind of destruction, as you say. There are so much division, there's so much hatred, there's so many people who are on drugs. Alcohol is a big problem in a country like Denmark, where everything seems very nice on the surface. And you can go on and on. It seems right under the surface, people are really struggling a lot with life and all these kind of evils that are coming on.
And the question then really becomes, what can help us to become better persons? What kind of source of peace? What kind of source of love? What can we do in order to avoid this kind of war that we're living in on so many social levels in Europe? We're rich on material wealth, but we seem to have lost much of the inner values that used to characterize us more and that used to be ideals in our societies in the past. And of course, you're mentioning evil. I mean, that's a whole concept within Christianity, is the thought that there is a God and there is a devil. symbolically explaining
We are in
the division
we are in a
between.
spiritual struggle, not only a political struggle these days, a spiritual battle.
This is true, and everything in this physical world transcends into the spiritual world. And Plato, he explained that quite eloquently, really, when he spoke about the world of ideas, the place where the horse is not sick. He was trying to explain the transcendence between the worlds, to say that in that other world, the horse never gets sick. It's always well, it's always perfect. Everything is perfect. But in our world, the horse gets sick. And, we're fragile and things go wrong. And in this prospect, the older, more traditional European way of looking at it, more connected to the Christian values and the spiritual values, would then say we need to look at the dark driving forces and whatever is good in our lives. And we need to very carefully seek out to do that which is good by the help of God.
So on that note, we have to end this episode of Herland Report. Thank you so much, Hanne Herland. We will be back with other episodes about the Christian faith and the European continent. It was a pleasure, and thanks to the viewers as well.